Welcome. I'm Neela Saldana. I'm the Executive Director at the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale, or Y-RISE, and it's my pleasure, along with Kasturi Gupta, who's very busy at the back of the room, who's the Director of Institutional Partnerships of South Asia, to welcome you here today. We are really excited. Y-RISE and the South Asia Council are housed in the MacMillan Center at Yale University, and we have Heidi McAnally-Linz, who's the Deputy Director here. Our Director, Stephen Wilkinson, sends his best regards. He was very excited, but unfortunately he's traveling and he can't make it. And Macmillan is the focal point at Yale University for anything international, programs, councils, research, etc. It's also my great pleasure to introduce Scott MacMillan, no relation to the Macmillan Center, I do have to say that, the Director of Learning and Innovation for BRAC. He's a former speechwriter and now the author of the book Hope Over Fate about Sir Fazle. He'll talk a little bit about that. He believed in the science of ending global poverty. And we're here to talk about that legacy and also about some exciting future directions. We're thrilled to actually welcome the team from BRAC. Welcome. And really, we hope that there'll be a great panel discussion and exciting news about announcing a partnership with Y-RISE and BRAC. So Y-RISE, as a research initiative, our mission is to advance the science of scaling. And we believe that there's a lot of great work done in development around poverty alleviation and growth. And that's been in the innovation space. If you had heard of the randomized controlled trials revolution, you've seen a lot of that work. And we actually believe that there is a gap in terms of scaling these programs. And I'm sure all the practitioners in this room really appreciate that. When it comes to scaling programs, there's lots of things that we don't know we can get better at. And Y-RISE was set up by faculty director, Professor Mushfiq Mubarak, with that specific intent to fill that gap in the ecosystem with rigorous research so that and the magic is in partnering with organizations like BRAC, who have so much institutional knowledge and experience, and a magic combination of sort of research and practice. So we all get better and the world gets better at scaling these really, really large programs because, as we always say, poverty is a problem of global scale. So we can't go to that fight, with small-scale solutions. We have to think big, and we have to think fast and big. So I'm very pleased to have the team here today to announce our partnership. So we'll have Scott speak, and after that, my colleague, Heidi McAnally-Linz. She's a deputy director at Macmillan. She will facilitate and moderate this exciting panel. So welcome.
Short video. Thanks.
He's been called one of the unsung heroes of modern times. Fazle Hasan Abed was more than just a mild-mannered accountant. As a young man in the early 1970s, he had a corporate multinational job in finance. He could have stayed on that career path and led a very comfortable life. Instead, in 1972, confronted with war and natural disaster in his homeland, he quit his job and founded BRAC, originally the Bangladesh Rehabilitation Assistance Committee.
People died because they were poor. And I thought that the kind of life I was leading at the time, working for Shell Oil, I thought that this life is not really something that I'd like to pursue. I'd like to pursue something else.
In the decades to come, BRAC would become massive, reaching 100 million people in Asia and Africa. It is known as one of the world's most effective anti-poverty efforts. Abed avoided the limelight. He preferred to let his work speak for itself. Microfinance, community healthcare, education, humanitarian aid, and more. What links these diverse programs together is Abed's lifelong conviction that hope itself can help people overcome poverty. He saw that poverty was not just a lack of money or skills. People remained trapped in poverty, in part because they thought things could never change. They thought it was their fate to be poor. So Abed started by changing this mindset. He gathered people in small groups to talk about their problems so that together they could confront the injustices that held them back. They began to understand that a better world was possible and that they themselves had the power to build it. This is the power of hope. Millions of people planning for the future, saving and investing, girls filling up classrooms, women starting their own businesses. BRAC is known for its entrepreneurial approach to tackling poverty. It is known for being efficient and effective, but it is far more than that. The legacy of Fazle Hasan Abed is the triumph of hope over fate.
Life is for a short period on earth, and I would like that short period that each of us have to be as happy and as productive and as meaningful as possible.
Hi. So, in 2011, I learned about an organization called BRAC. I was a freelance journalist at the time, and I was traveling overland in Africa, and I was actually there was a dinner that it was at the Serena Hotel in Nairobi. I was not staying there because I couldn't afford it, but a friend was in town and started telling me about this. I had caught the development bug, so to speak, by which I mean a curiosity about what works and what doesn't work in international development and poverty programs, and I thought about maybe looking for a job in that sector, even though I really had no previous experience there. And this friend started telling me about this job opening that she knew about at a place called BRAC, that BRAC was hiring, and BRAC this and BRAC that. And I said, what are you saying? Like, no, BRAC, you don't, well, I'm talking about a job at BRAC. It's like, it's still just a sound. I have no idea what you're talking about. And of course, I ended up looking it up, and I thought to myself, wow, how come nobody told me about these guys before? And long story short, I ended up working in communications. Asif was actually at my first interview, so anything that goes wrong from now on, you can blame him. I showed up late. You still remember that? Okay, we're off to a good start. Unlike so many other failed development schemes, BRAC, which was formerly Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, was known for being efficient and effective, and it seemed to have a reputation for development done right. And it was credited with having transformed Bangladesh, and its founder, Sir Fazle Hasan Abed, you just heard his voice now, had recently been knighted by the Queen for his services to humanity. So long story short, despite not having very much experience in that sector, I did get the job. And in the years to come, I developed a rapport with the founder of the organization and ended up working as his speechwriter for several years. Despite his knighthood and his stature, he was a very soft-spoken man. He wasn't, frankly, very good at marketing himself, if I can say so. He was the opposite in some respects of a lot of self-promoters that tend to populate the nonprofit sector. And yet, he was revered in the international development sector. I also found that he had this amazing story that had never really been told before, and I thought, gosh, somebody should probably write a book about that someday, and I did not know that that person would end up being me. Abed was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer in about mid-2019 and was told he had about 4 or 5 months to live, and sure enough, he died months later, but not encouraging me to finally finish that book that I'd been working on for many years so that he could, quote unquote, as he said, read it on my deathbed, which I did, most of it. There's nothing like a deadline to really to motivate you to finish a project, and here we are. So I would like to just read a few passages from the book. I'd like to talk a little bit about how this, first of all, how the title came about, this idea, the title and the idea of hope over fate. After spending many, many hours talking to Abed and hearing his stories and piecing together the various threads, I realized that there was, in fact, a theme that united his life's work. I struggled with the title just as so many people in the past have struggled to define what BRAC is really all about. It's funny, because Abed said at one point, you know, if you do, you can do one or two things well. If you do too many things, you're generally not going to do any of them very well. And this is true. He was talking about managing people at the time and the tasks that one takes on. And yet BRAC itself did so many different things and did them so well and did them at such scale that it seemed a little bit, I had trouble sort of piecing that together, since it works in so many different areas, as you heard about: microfinance, women's health care, education, legal empowerment, and on and on and on. I finally realized there was a theme that united his life's work, and this was going back as early as the 1970s. And this was the idea that people all too often remained poor, in part because they believed it was their fate to be poor. And if you gave them a reason, a good reason, to believe that the future could be better, that is, if you gave them hope, this itself had the power to help them overcome poverty. It wasn't the thing itself that would solve the poverty problem. I understand I'm talking to a lot of, there are economists in the room and other researchers who are going to, I have to qualify everything very carefully right here. But if you gave them hope and you gave them an understanding that there are things they could do, however small, to help bring about that positive change in their lives, with their families, with their communities, that this itself was a power, almost like nutrition or giving people an injection of capital or assets, that this had a power to raise productivity, to raise well-being, to raise people's happiness. I have to say this theory is potentially misleading and perhaps even downright dangerous, since it risks creating the impression that poverty is somehow self-inflicted, that all you really need is a mindset shift or a pep talk. Hey, I think about a woman that I met. I met her twice, and if I go back to Bangladesh, I would like she in the whole BRAC universe, she's one person that really I would like to go back with my family and introduce them to her. Her name is Shohida Begum. She lives in northern Bangladesh. When I met her, she told the story of her, how she got to where she was, and she told a story of years before being so ground down, really, by her conditions that she hadn't eaten for several days. She had to go to work at a local brickyard and working for pennies per day. Until she joined a BRAC program, which we now call a graduation program. It's a program tailored for people in extreme destitution. And through that program, she began building her assets. And when I met her, first of all, the thing that I noticed the most about her, she was confident and she was loud. When she would you don't know what it was like here. I've come from a different country. You don't know much about my land. Let me tell you, people didn't even have clothes to wear. And I happened to be with a police escort at the time because there was violence against foreigners. I don't think it was necessary, but anyway, I was there were cops there. And she starts shouting at them, you never come here. You don't have to come here because we all get along here. And I just thought to myself, in America, you don't yell at the cops, first of all. So, and I think about the story that she told about herself and the woman that she was before. And, the confidence that I see is not the woman that she described earlier. Now, common sense might tell you that, well, she's confident now because she's risen out of poverty, because she has 3 acres of land, 2 goats, 3 cows, and 15 chickens, plus she had when I saw her the last time, she had recently bought a milk cart that she was renting out to people in the village to carry milk around. Okay, that's why she's so confident. There is actually an increasing amount of research that suggests that the causality may also flow in the opposite direction, that she rose out of poverty because of her newfound confidence, because of her newfound self-worth. I say this is a potentially dangerous idea because you can't buy a loaf of bread or feed your family with hope, right? Hope itself isn't enough, but it has to be part of the solution, and it does seem to explain, to me anyway, why so many poverty programs fail. So I'm going to read a passage from the book that is actually, when I heard Abed tell me this story for the first time, I remember thinking, gosh, that's a nice little story. It would be nice if we could capture that somehow. I'd never really heard it before. So the year is 1974. Put a pin in that. 1974 was the year that I was born. Now you know how old I am. It also happens to be the year that Abed's daughter was born. And sorry, it's in the book. Now everybody knows how old Tamara is. The year is 1974. The location, a remote part of northern Bangladesh. Fazle Hasan Abed has already spent the last 2 years working with impoverished refugees from the Bangladesh War of Liberation. Poverty is deeply entrenched in it, and it has been a struggle to create change. Abed has begun experimenting with a new method for teaching people basic skills like reading and writing. It starts by gathering people in an open space in the village. It's based on the dialogue-based methodology pioneered just a few years earlier by a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire. I go into that in the book. This is not what we're talking about now. But in any case, the people gathered in an open space in the village, often outside, in front of a poster, a single sheet of paper with a drawing based on the word home, Bari, B-A-R-I in Bengali. Why is the home important? The teacher would ask, pointing to an image. The villagers pointed out that the word signified more than just a dwelling. It includes children, spouses, livestock, the patch of land surrounding the hut. And once the discussion got underway, the classes would often get very animated. Some people's homes are bigger than others, one person might say, or during stormy nights, it rains right through my roof. Another might chip in, well, why don't you fix it, the teacher would say. Well, because I'm poor, I can't afford to. Next came the word bagh, B-A-G-H, the word for tiger. Every Bengali person knows what a tiger is, even if they haven't met one face to face. It's sort of the national animal, so to speak, and what it represents most of all, which is fierceness, wildness, the untamed state of nature. The teacher, who is now acting more like a facilitator, would ask, "Can a tiger build a house?" Of course not, the people in the group replied. A tiger cannot build a house. If it rains, he runs under a tree. He does not have the ability to change his environment. He can only adapt himself to whatever happens. Can you build a house? The facilitator asks. Well, of course, the villagers replied. They discuss it amongst themselves. If we had access to the tools and the materials, we could all build homes for ourselves. Human beings are therefore different from the tiger because we adapt ourselves, we adapt nature to suit our needs, whereas the tiger can only adapt himself to nature. We do not go from place to place. This is the teacher or the facilitator talking. We don't go from place to place in search of food, but we choose to plant seeds and till the soil so we can stay put. That is our choice. The process of changing nature to suit the needs of human beings through their own creative activities is the process of civilization itself. And it is humans alone who engage in it. The tiger cannot plan ahead. He cannot build a boat to go from one village to the next when the floods come. In the words of Paulo Freire, the tiger exists in an quote-unquote overwhelming present, with no history, no development, and little concept of today and tomorrow. Nor can a tiger do much to help another tiger. 100 tigers cooperating with each other still could not build a house, but men and women acting together can do many things. Can each of you discuss what creative activities you've done today? The facilitator would then ask. Somebody might volunteer that they had planted seeds or harvested rice. Another might have repaired the thatch on the roof. Perhaps somebody worked on a flood wall to redirect the flow of water so it would irrigate the fields properly. And the point started to become clear. They had already contributed to the building of civilized life. Society was theirs to own and to shape, not something given to them, not something ordained by God or given to them by a higher power. Acting collectively, they could do many more things. Poverty had been made by humans. It could be unmade by them too. And this was the most basic lesson for human consciousness. The effect on the villagers was remarkable. They began to question their situation, imagine a better future for themselves, and think constructively about how they could work together to bring it about. It would not be enough to simply encourage critical thinking. Access to essential services like credit, livelihood training, and healthcare would still be needed, but none of these would mean a thing if the people did not believe first in the possibility of change. The first sparks of self-worth had begun to flicker, and once lit, those flames would be very, very hard to extinguish. That's kind of to me, that was the formative moment for what became, in the years to come, BRAC. In my book, I try to draw a link between the work of the Freirean work in the early 1970s, early mid-1970s, and some of the research that has been done by the likes of Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, on the power of hope as capability, if you will. And I do think there's a direct line to be drawn there. It was the driving conviction of Abed's life. So there's one more thing that I want to touch upon, and then we can have a little discussion. It's this concept of scale. So I'm going to read another passage from the book, which I don't actually have printed out, so this is going to be awkward. Hold on. One of the most refreshing interviewees for this book was a woman named Kanis Fatima, who was, she was actually Abed's age, and was not, she didn't call him Abed Bhai, as others did. She called him Mr. Abed. And refreshing because when I interviewed her, she lived just outside Philadelphia. And I went and spent some time with her, spent a good day with her twice. And she provided one of the more refreshing views on Abed and BRAC. For while she greatly respected Abed, she did not lionize him as others did, nor did she idealize her 17 years at BRAC, which she described as an organization where, quote unquote, proper dialogue was often lacking, yet that somehow succeeded in spite of itself. And when I hear some of my colleagues talking about the problems that we have, breaking down silos, or we don't communicate enough with each other, we're very bad at knowledge management, and BRAC isn't what it used to be, I think about the fact that this has always been the case. Like even before BRAC became great, people were talking about, oh, we're so dysfunctional, and then yeah, we're scaling up and we're changing the world here, people. So, take that to heart. Any development practitioners or people that go into development, if you ever get frustrated enough that you just want to throw all your toys out of the baby carriage, remember that. That's not the story that I wanted to read. That's the intro. It'll still be short. Okay. Kanis Fatima was one of Abed's chief deputies at the time, in charge of the nascent education program. Another was a man by the name of Aminul Alam, who was Abed's field marshal, so to speak. And he shouted a lot and people were scared of him. Let's just put it that way. Amin wanted to try to do everything under the sun to improve people's health and livelihoods, even if it meant encroaching on Kanis's turf. He also had the persuasive qualities of a bulldozer. He was excited by the idea of a frontline cadre of school teachers advancing the development agenda. This is Abed talking. Amin would see tremendous possibilities of these teachers being used for other things, said Abed. He would suggest the teachers be mobilized for immunizing children, for instance. And Khanis would say, no, 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 I want my teachers completely focused on education. Abed credited Khanis with guarding the program vigilantly. Ultimately, Khanis won that argument, Abed said. Too many things you don't do well. One or two things you do well. Khanis wanted that. She was a good manager in that sense. He added she would not take nonsense from anyone. She was in complete control of her program. I want to pause and just say a little bit about the background of both Amin and Khanis Fatima. Neither of them had worked in development previous to joining BRAC. Neither of them had worked anywhere before BRAC. Khanis Fatima was basically a housewife when she joined BRAC and had never worked had done a formal job at an organization prior to joining BRAC. In fact, she joined because of a terrible tragedy that took place in her life. Her son died unexpectedly, which, if you have kids, is just the most unimaginable thing that you could imagine. And it sent her into a deep depression, and the only way that she could find to get out of it was to work, and to work hard. And she confessed to me that even 10 years later, she still came home and felt that pain. So she channeled that into her work. It wasn't the educational expertise that was driving her, and Amin was the same way. Abed laughed when he recalled some of his own arguments with Khanis. Now you have 20 schools, he told her. Next month, I want to set up 200 schools. Khanis threw her hands up and said, "You can't do that." "Of course we can," Abed replied calmly. "We'll train people. We can do that now that we have all these training centers." They had recently set up training centers all across the country. Khanis herself admitted, to me that is, that she resisted Abed's push to expand as quickly as they did. She recalled the initial proposal to expand to 150 schools. "For me, it was unrealistic," she said, "and in the next few years, we were going to have a few thousand schools. I banged on the doors of Amin and Abed, but no one would listen to me. I said, you just can't do it." One BRAC insider called her a plodder, Plodder, which may have been the case, but this was fine as far as Abed was concerned. Vision and ambition were his domain, execution was hers. Ultimately, she was not experienced enough to insist, as others might have, that what Abed was demanding simply could not be done. This may explain a great deal of Abed's story in general. People accomplishing the impossible because they didn't know any better. People often ask, what is the secret to BRAC's scale? Scale is a byword for BRAC. If aliens come to Earth and look at BRAC, why is this organization so large and others in the nonprofit sector haven't achieved anything like that scale? Having written an entire book about it, I don't know, actually. There are answers that you could give. Are there geopolitical explanations? The population density of Bangladesh. This is a land that is unlike no other on Earth. Perhaps providing services at scale is just a lot easier in such a crowded place. The politics of the country were very much, the government was so dysfunctional that it stepped back and allowed BRAC to grow. The leadership, right? Abed was an amazing person. He was a remarkably driven individual. He had an entrepreneurial approach. He took his cues from the private sector. Abed also did not believe in the great men theory of history, so I'm not sure if he would buy that one. And yet, some of the a little bit of these are all probably true, but I think there's also something there that BRAC was driven by people that did not have the experience to say, what you are asking me to do just can't be done, and so they went and they did it. The topic of scale is going to come up later in our discussion, so I'm going to end it right there.
Scott, thanks so much. Yeah, please come join us. My name is Heidi McAnally-Linz, as Neela said, and I'm the Deputy Director here at the MacMillan Center. We're so glad you're here. The MacMillan Center is the Center for International and Area Studies at Yale, and we bring together kind of regional focus. So the South Asia team is co-hosting this event with us, as well as a number of research initiatives across the globe. And one of those is Y-RISE. So we're really thrilled to be able to kind of bring both of those together today. And I'm just going to start with my own mini BRAC story before I introduce our panelists, and just say, exactly what Scott was saying about how frustrating it can be working in development was kind of how I showed up to what's known as the Randomista movement, or the randomized control trial movement. And I had been working in Guatemala with widows of the internal armed conflict there, a number of extremely old to poor widows. And we tried everything, and almost always it felt like we were failing. When I first heard of BRAC, I had just seen a preprint of a science paper, one of the biggest journals, if you don't know science. And this was a paper that had brought together research across 6 countries. And this is a demonstration of BRAC scale beyond Bangladesh, from Bangladesh to the world, as the slogan goes, where this study across 6 countries had shown that the graduation program, adapted in all these contexts, pioneered by this organization I had never heard of called BRAC, was actually working across contexts. And it had been adapted, of course, using all the theories that show up in the book. But it was billed to me as the most effective program that anyone had seen for ultra poverty. And as I was looking at this preprint, I was charged with writing the press release that would kind of go out broadly. My role was in communications at the time, working for an organization called Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA. And I remember thinking to myself when I looked at this, finally someone has figured out something that can give us hope of what might actually work. And then as I learned more and more about the scale of the organization and the kind of ongoing learning culture, and eventually also learned about this culture of hope, culture of humility, and tinkering and continuing to learn and improve, which are still the things that mark BRAC for me today. I introduced myself to a bunch of the board members as a BRAC fangirl. So with that, I will say I'm a BRAC fangirl, and I'm so thrilled to have all of you here today with us. And so I'll introduce the panel. Tamara Hasan Abed is, as she's already been explained, is the daughter of Sir Fazle, but is also the managing director now of BRAC Enterprises. And Mushfiq Mubarak, who many of you know, is the professor of economics here at Yale, and also the faculty chair and the founder of Y-RISE. Asif Saleh is the executive director of BRAC, and you've all gotten to know Scott pretty well over the last couple of minutes. So I'm just going to start with a few questions, and then I hope all of you are thinking of your questions, because we do hope this can kind of become a bit of a conversation. So I'm going to start with Tamara. When Scott was reading this book, right, he was talking about how it was a family affair and how BRAC is so known for this process of scaling up. You were a kid at the time. A lot of this growth was happening. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what you remember about what he was doing, and then how that kind of, and how you got to where you are today along the way.
Sure, thank you. So as Scott already revealed, I was born in 1974, 2 years after BRAC was born. And my mother, Aisha Abed, was also working with my father in BRAC. And they were great partners together. So I spent a lot of my childhood going to these rural villages with them. And in fact, we would spend the first place where BRAC started working in a region in Bangladesh called Sylhet, and a place called Shalla. We used to go and stay there a week every month. And so my dad would go more often, but my mom and I would travel with him and would spend a week there. So I remember from my childhood, Shalla was, we lived in a sort of tin shack, where water would leak, and We didn't really have proper toilets or anything like that, and we'd have to get there on a speedboat, the thrill of which I loved. But that's kind of how I grew up. So I grew up a lot in BRAC offices because my mom would take me along with her, as well as, to the field and all of that. And, I saw my dad sort of, having long meetings till late at night, sometimes till 3, 4 in the morning. And sort of they would continue discussing things without any timeline until they would crack whatever it is that they were discussing. So it was constantly trying to, find, dig deeper and find out more about, how people lived, what problems they were facing, what were the issues in the community, and all of that. And I also remember, sort of in the mid-'70s, when BRAC started working in other areas, I would go with my mother and a person called Marty Chen, who's right now the chair of our global board. The two of them would go around Bangladeshi villages trying to find craftspeople before, for this enterprise that BRAC was going to start in handicrafts, because BRAC organized groups of women in rural villages and, sort of taught them skills in craft making and silk farming. And so when BRAC came up with the idea of having its own retail outlet, Marty and my mother would go around villages to locate master craftsmen and get sort of old Bangladeshi designs and whatever they happened to have that they had, that their mothers were wearing or their grandmothers were wearing, things that they'd made that were in their household or in their community, just to sort of collect things and develop designs and products out of them. And the reason I talk specifically about Arong is because, that's one of the enterprises I run now. So those were some of my I spent also a lot of time in the BRAC offices. And in fact, what Scott was talking about, these schools and Kanis Fatima, I remember, in fact, one day being in my dad's office, and he used to do a lot of back-of-the-envelope calculations. So, I remember them having a conversation in the early 80s or, probably in the early or mid-80s, that there were about 22 schools that they were piloting. And my dad and he would often do that, his sort of ambition for scale, he would write down numbers, like, okay, year 1 you would have, this many hundreds of schools, and year 2 it became like a few thousand, and then in year 3 and 4 it's like a few 100,000. So the way it would kind of, the way he would calculate that they could scale, like it would, I remember Kanis Fatima like being like, "Are you crazy?" Like. And him sort of explaining to her, and I would, spend time just hanging around, pottering around my dad's office. Like he had a table with some, visitor chairs, next to his desk, and I would often do drawing and this and that and tinker around with stuff over there. I'd, sit around with his secretary and, sort of press the typewriter and be fascinated with that. Or the cyclostyle machine. I don't know if some of you may never even have heard of that, but it was sort of the old version of the photocopier. And so those are the kinds of things I'd be doing in the office, and I'd, often hang out with my parents and sort of hear different conversations, some of which, I remember little bits of. And so this conversation with Kanis Fatima, I remember my dad sort of just, explaining to her how many, in order to come up with this many schools, how much training would be needed, and so therefore how many trainers would be needed, and how much time would be spent to do that, and then, how much time it would take to mobilize sort of the materials and, and all of that, and just having a complete, like, plan that was in his head, that he was just writing sort of roughly, right? And so, yeah, these were some of the things. So, in terms of how I came into BRAC, I had little stints in BRAC doing internships, during school. And then I remember sort of one summer, working as a sales associate in one of the Arong outlets, and then, I did various other things. One time, I was editing the newsletter of our education program at some point when I was in school. So various stints, and then I joined BRAC once, and then I did my economics for my undergrad, and then I moved back to Bangladesh and joined, started working in corporate finance for an investment bank. And then I did 2 years of that, and then I wanted to have a business of my own, because eventually I wanted to go to business school, and I thought some entrepreneurship experience would be a good story to tell, because everybody who was in investment banking applied for an MBA, and I wouldn't be able to differentiate myself. So, so I opened up my own business, and I was also working part-time in BRAC in the urban program that we had at the time, working with groups of women in slums in and around Dhaka, organizing them to have businesses, train them, give them capital, and then sort of handhold them so that they could run successful businesses. So I did that for a little bit, and then I came to New York to do my MBA at Columbia, and then went back into investment banking because I had these loans to pay off. So I joined Goldman, and then 9/11 happened a few months after I had joined, and I then decided that life was too fragile, and I was too far away from home, and my dad was, I think, 65 at the time, and I thought he was probably at the fag end of his life, and I wanted to be closer to home. So I went back to Bangladesh, and I think in January 2002, my father asked me, and not really thinking that I would join BRAC or anything, but I just wanted to reevaluate what I wanted to do. 9/11, I think, also made me realize that what I was doing wasn't very purposeful, and I wanted to do something a bit more purposeful with my life. You're shaking your head because I think you made that choice at some point to switch from FMCG to what you do now, Neela. So, so in any case, I went back to Bangladesh and to evaluate what I wanted to do, and I thought about joining the UN and going to Afghanistan, and the war had broken out in Afghanistan and all that, and I was quite angry with everything, because in the corridors at Goldman and all over New York, there was so much Muslim bashing, not that I'm religious or anything, but it was just, just didn't seem, so in any case, so my dad asked me to help out in Arong, because it was going through a management transition in January 2002. And I started working with this enterprise of BRAC, which is BRAC's flagship enterprise. It is now the largest sort of retailer in Bangladesh, so it's the most popular brand. And so, I went in and I started working with craftspeople and designers, and I loved that. And I loved the thrill of the retail business, because you get evaluated on a daily basis. You know exactly how you're doing. And if you didn't make the sales today, you can't make that up tomorrow. So it's literally a report card every day. And most of all, I just loved the fact that the way I could see that it was changing the lives of people who were working with us. And so it was just the combination of those three things. I fell in love with my job, and I felt like I'd found my calling. So that's how I came into BRAC, about 20 years ago now.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask Asif a little bit about scale, but I wonder if actually you can give everyone a sense of the scale of BRAC Enterprises right now, just very quickly. Like what does it entail, and what's the scale of it, just to help folks understand the scope, because it's huge.
At the moment, we have 10 social enterprises. Our largest is Arong, as I said, and I think last year our revenues were about $106 million. So we have a $200 million portfolio in terms of revenues at our social enterprise portfolio. And our largest enterprises are Arong, and then we have one in dairy. And so we have quite a few in the agro sector, in dairy and seed and agro, where we produce and we sell high-yielding and hybrid varieties of seeds to farmers. Dairy, we collect milk from smallholder farmers, process it, and sell it in urban markets. So it's making a linkage between all the people who borrow money from us and buy cows and need a need a stable place to sell their milk at fair prices. We collect milk from them all over Bangladesh, and we process it and sell it. So we have enterprise in artificial insemination for better breed of livestock. We have enterprise in fisheries. We have nurseries, etc.
Just wanted to give you a taste because I've now learned a good bit about BRAC, but even I was surprised by kind of the big scope of it. So Asif, in your role, right, Scott has punted on this question of why do you think BRAC has been so successful at scale when no one else has? But what I would love to hear is from you, what do you think are some of the ingredients that have allowed that to happen and flourish?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Scott has correctly said, I think there is no one magic bullet, but obviously, just to give you an understanding as well, kind of carrying on the scale. So beyond the social enterprises that Tamara mentioned, so from our schools, we have about 15 million children have graduated. These are mostly marginalized schools. So at one point, we ran 64,000 schools in Bangladesh. In microfinance portfolio, this year, we are on target to disburse about $5 billion. So we have almost 7 million borrowers. And in healthcare, we have almost close to 40,000 healthcare volunteers and workers across the country. In water and sanitation, half of the country, we built latrines for rural villagers. So in many areas, and in Rohingya refugee crisis, we are the largest responder right now, with almost 2,500 of our staff working there. But we also have investments like SME Bank. BRAC Bank started as an SME bank when nobody wanted to start up a bank was supporting small businesses. So now it has become one of the most profitable banks. One of the subsidiaries of BRAC Bank is bCash, which is a mobile financial service delivery. It is one of the largest in the world. And so there are many examples like that. But it didn't start with a grand plan that BRAC is going to be like this, right? I think this all happened organically. And partly because really the organization and the founder, they are social entrepreneurs. And what does an entrepreneur do? Entrepreneur, when you think about from a commercial case, they look for gaps, they look for opportunities, and then they basically go to potentially where the consumers would pay for those services, and that's where the big bucks come in. But for a social entrepreneur looks for gaps in social areas. So in terms of where are the social problems lie, which is not being addressed neither by public sector or by private sector. So that's where somewhere in the midpoint where social entrepreneurs come in. So the organization always looked for those kinds of opportunities in terms of problem solving. So it's actually a solution ecosystem, if I can call it, where it tried to figure out solutions to social challenges. So initially started with that whole relief, or as a relief organization where the refugees were coming back after our liberation war. So this entire group of young people led by Sir Fazle were very much motivated by rebuilding the country. That we have to, after this bloody war, we will have to rebuild the country. We have to support the people who are coming back. But then very soon, then it translated into that, okay, now the next thing is that after relief, look for livelihood opportunities. What are the things that we can do? So microfinance came in, sort of livelihood opportunities. A lot of the social enterprises, the genesis were problem solving. Scott mentioned the school. So when we started talking to parents or sort of our people who are in the village organizations who were organized for the microfinance, they said, why? We asked them why don't they send their kids to school, and then they gave the reasons, and then the model was designed in such a way that it addressed those problems. Like my son or my daughter has to help me at the farm during daytime, so they can't go to the formal schools. So flexible timing was introduced. The schools where the government school was too far, I'm worried that he will have an accident, that I am not feeling safe. I don't want to. So this one room model it was not based on infrastructure, set up within your community. I did not know what they're being taught, so I don't know whether that's going to be relevant or not. So the parent-teacher meeting got introduced in that idea. So many things like that are like specifically addressing those problems, and then they will say like, okay, here's your school, come and send your children to school. So, but then that's the first part. So that's piloting part, right? So the design part, which is very much problem-centered. Now we call it human-centered design, but this is what human-centered design was. But then the next step was that making it really impactful. That is it really working? Are people coming to schools, or if they're not sending their children to school, why are they? So go back and iterate until you figure out that this is a very effective model. Then the next step was that, okay, so nothing was designed in BRAC which is not scalable. It has to scale. And because there are too many problems, that's one thing that he used to say, that small is beautiful, but large is necessary, because in resource-constrained countries like ours, you can't just afford to do things that are small and beautiful and nice, but which doesn't solve the problem in the larger part, but the whole country needs it. So the piloting also had to be done in different contexts as well. So it may not be just working in one area, but not working the other area. So you actually get a flavor of different contexts as well. But then once you are fairly confident that this is an effective model, then the process of thinking around scaling that happened, right? So scaling means that really identify what are the most essential components. So you have to make it cost effective. So that meant that you have to kind of reduce the non-essential element, routinized tasks, as much as possible, so that staff can be trained easily. So that's where we'd call it the perfecting scale, right? So taking out the non-essential elements, and then the big push of scale that, roll it out, that Tamara was mentioning, that thousands and thousands. So that school started with 22 schools. That process went in terms of kind of getting the pilot right for a year or two. But then when it scaled, it was like scaled massively. At one point, we were running in 2009, 64,000 schools. So essentially, I think that is, I think, the harder part. But I think the softer part of what initially drove it was that courage of an entrepreneur, that risk-taking ability. So, which is often seen probably in the business side, but not so much in the social side. I think that is the distinguishing factor. And then he injected that ambition and courage within the sort of the organization, and then led to that, you can do it. And I think the first intervention that gave the organization that confidence that we can do things at scale was the well-researched and known oral rehydration campaign, right, where BRAC healthcare workers went to every single household in Bangladesh and taught mothers how to make oral rehydration saline to stop children from dying from diarrheal diseases. And this was a very mammoth task. Then when that was done successfully over a period of a few years, then we did the immunization of children in half the country. Was split up between government and BRAC. And that was done in the 80s as well. So this really gave that organization that confidence that you can think big. And the other thing I should mention, that we never in the BRAC, even now, we don't do projects based on. First of all, we don't do projects. We want to do long-term programming, right? So it's essentially, I think, BRAC's own financial independence also gives us that ability, that thinking big, thinking long-term, thinking depth of programming. Like, are you solving that problem that you're kind of trying to solve in the first phase? And until it doesn't get solved, you continue working on this. And so that's where sort of the slightly different thinking from traditional NGOs, where it's predominantly driven by fundraising, right? You raise money and then you deliver, and when the funding is gone, you wrap up and you move on. it was always driven by the vision, right? So I asked him one day that, that there is that criticism that, the state's responsibility is to give education to children. So why is BRAC doing this? So that is kind of almost taking that sort of, taking that state's job. Like, BRAC, one of the BRAC criticism is that, it's an alternative state. But he said that, I can wait for the state to get their act together, but there are millions of children right now who doesn't have access to education. And if I don't do that, do this scaling for BRAC schools, this entire generation is going to be lost. So this is always that risk of not doing something, that the urgency, that impatient optimism always drove the organization. That was the key fact. So I think, now is a very good example where BRAC is scaled down the schools because the government has now set up public schools across the country. So the need for having BRAC schools are not there in terms of access point of view, but there is very much need from a quality education perspective. So we are looking at that now. How do we provide quality, better quality education in terms of 21st century skills and all the other things? We are designing new models like that as well. So I think it's a combination of that discipline and also that ambition and courage. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and again, the scale is just always so impressive every time I learn more about the 64,000 schools, right? Like that's massive. Mushfiq, I'm going to direct the next one to you. Obviously, scaling up comes with all kinds of challenges, right? So maybe you could give us there's some even mentioned in the book of some things that didn't work as they tried to scale up. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of those challenges in scaling that you've seen through your research, and even sometimes ones that are successfully shown through RCTs to work at the pilot phase that don't necessarily scale, and why they might falter and how we might work on measuring that.
Okay. Thanks, Heidi. So we've been at Y-RISE, we've been teaching a class this week on exactly this. So I'm a little bit sick of talking about that. But I also feel like everybody else got to share their story about BRAC and like their life at BRAC. I want to share my story as well.
I'll allow it. It's okay.
And yeah, I think, the boring part of the story is that like most Dhaka residents, my initial interaction with BRAC is through Arung, right? Like the piece of clothing I'm wearing, the Punjabi I'm wearing, I remember going to it right before Eid every year and going to Arung and getting a Punjabi. Right. In fact, so I wore this and something like this yesterday at a much more highfalutin event, and then every day Asif sees me, he's like, "Oh, that's an interesting thing you're wearing. Like you're supposed to." So my response to Asif was, finally the monarch that we had since 1947 is just gone. Now we are allowed to wear this. You don't need to wear this anymore. and hopefully Arung's business will go up now that we're allowed. So yeah, I mean, the rest of you, all the South Asians in the room, we're now free to wear what we want. Okay, no, more seriously, my first interaction with BRAC was actually the other book called A Simple Solution that, and the story that Asif just alluded to about oral rehydration therapy, right? The story is remarkable. BRAC workers went to 10 million households. 13 million, wow. Door to door, and taught mothers how to create with local indigenous ingredients something that would save their child's life. It's a very low-hanging fruit, right? These are the types of reasons why infant mortality went down. It's halved in Bangladesh over a very quick period, and it's possibly the reason why these types of social indicators like maternal mortality, infant mortality are better than our neighbors and states in India, for example, that have like 3 times the GDP per capita, right? I mean, there has to be something to do with the fact that we were very successful in picking off these low-hanging fruit, like childhood immunization against the simple causes. I mean, simple meaning simple to fix causes that causes deaths, right? We were really incredibly good at solving those problems, right? And here's how good we were, so this was both BRAC as well as government partnerships. The social marketing campaigns also that mothers needed to know that this is what you do. that jingle from when I was growing up in Bangladesh, Ek Chimti Lobon, Ek Mudkur, Ek Sherpani. Ada Sherpani. Okay. I would have killed my kid again. Right. Yeah. So
You have to remember the jingle. That's
Yeah.
why it's a jingle.
Cool. Yeah. So it's been, but like, look, I mean, the last time I heard it was 1984. But still, I still remember, that's how successful it was. And, maybe that's what scale is, right? The scale is that you come up with something that people remember 35 years later, right? And yeah, okay, of course, scaling is complex. So yeah, maybe, so I guess I could answer the question in the way that Heidi would want me to, but let me instead of talking like an academic, let me share another story, which is much more recent, right? On what we've been doing together. Okay, so during the pandemic, so we all dropped what we were doing. I mean, all of us in all different sectors, and we just started trying to figure out, okay, what do we do about this? Because everybody's flying blind. We've never been faced with such a complex crisis before, right? We didn't know what to do. It's not like we could just look for external support because the U.S. itself was, didn't have really clear-headed thinking, did not have the evidence, did not have the data, right? And we needed to produce everything on the fly, right? And so from early in the pandemic, on many different topics, so that's when Asif and I, as well as like A2I, Arnie Chaudhary, right? So like somebody from a representative of government, from the largest NGO, academics, we were all coming together trying to figure out how do we solve these problems, right? And we talked about so many and tried to solve so many different things. So one was, look, one thing that we were working on, okay, what should our lockdown policy be? Should we just blindly copy whatever the US and UK were doing? Do we need to save lives that way? Or do we need to think about these things differently, right? And a lot, we were doing modeling, and then a lot of it was really important for me to share those results very early with both government and BRAC so that all of our decisions could be sensible. And then we started talking about, okay, regardless of our view of whether we should be locking down or not, something that is absolutely without any doubt, any debate, is that we need to get money in the hands of poor people quickly, right? And so again, this is when Asif's former colleague Maria moderated, and we were talking about, okay, how do we now figure out very quickly how to target poor people, meaning how do we identify the people who need support the most, right? It's not like the US where you could just look at tax returns, and then if anybody was earning less than $75,000, you send them a check, right? And it turns out, we were trying to solve that problem, and then ultimately, given government privacy regulations over cell phone data, it became really difficult to solve the problem, right? So then, and then here's what we ended up doing. We were talking about masking, right? And I remember, okay, so this is also why indigenous solutions are important. So we all got on calls together with our international development partners. I guess that's what we call them, like the UK government, Swiss government, etc. Right?
Representative of the Queen.
Yes, exactly. So then, we kind of chatted, what do we need to do? How do we get masks out? And, we chatted for like 2 hours, and then nothing came out of it, right? Like really, like maybe something came out of it later on, but like initially, really, like it was 2 hours of really precious time at that time when Asif was busy, I was really busy, all of us were really busy, but nothing came out of it. And then, like I remember just calling up Asif separately on WhatsApp and just saying, you know what, we just got to do this, right? We can't wait for these people. So what was that? So, we had evidence at that point on like that mass work, right? The evidence that didn't exist in the WHO, the CDC, the US government, right? But more importantly, we had evidence on how to get people to wear masks, okay? And so then we started chatting about how we're going to do this. So we went, we wrote an op-ed together in both the Bangla Prothom Alo as well as in Daily Star. Then we went to, BIDS, the Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, again, another indigenous institution, organized a joint talk, right? And I remember like one phrase that comes from Asif that I still use and I put up on like social media sometimes. So you had this slide where he's like, okay, look, now we have the evidence, right? We know how to do this. We have the people. We have the Shasta Shevika Shasta Kurmi network around the country. We know how to do this, right? We also know the engineering of how to procure the mask, how to make the mask locally. We knew all of this, and his slide was titled, "If not now, then when?" Okay? And so sometimes you just gotta get stuff done, you know. And it was great to just have, it's great that during the the only silver lining from the pandemic is that it opened up communication and trust. Oh, I remember I think how trust was built. So one of the first calls, Asif, we were talking about, oh, this is the evidence, this is what we have to do. And Asif was asking me, and so what do you guys need? Right? So I was like, no, yeah. I was like, nothing. This is not, we're all in the middle of a pandemic, right? No, and I think, so there are many different answers as to why BRAC works. Of course, leadership, right? But also, in working with BRAC over the years, I think there's a special type of person who works at BRAC on the implementation side, right? I feel like there's, somehow you've managed to cultivate a culture where people work at BRAC for the right reasons, right? There's not much careerism, right? And people actually want to make a difference. So I think there's a lot of it is selection, right? But some of it is probably just once you're in the culture, there's also a treatment effect of BRAC. And on our side, now that we are doing things together, right? We basically during the mass work, you notice that a lot of the people that you got to know then, Janani, Neela, Heidi, right? They were none of them were actually working here at the time, right? So, what I learned from BRAC is, we need to get the right types of people. So we kind of just reconstituted that team, where they now have different job descriptions, but it's the same set of people, right? And now hopefully, we'll do bigger, better things together. Hopefully, not in crisis mode, not in any other pandemic, just just to push the country forward.
So I want to give folks time to ask us questions. I'm going to ask you each to give me one sentence on our future partnership. And Scott, I'm also going to ask you. So we promised today that we would share that we're going to be launching kind of a larger scale partnership, a collaboration between BRAC and Y-RISE on scaling, on the science of scaling together. I wonder if each of you could say, what you think, how you think that's important for your work and for your organizations, and what you hope to get out of it. And then I'm going to ask the two of you to say quickly what you think Sir Fazle might say about that. Okay, there you go.
Great. Yeah, I think the last part of the story he didn't mention, which was that once his evidence came out, we did the talk. We were able to generate a lot of money to distribute the mask and change people's behavior. So Delta was kind of ravaging India at that time, and we were running against the clock in Bangladesh because it was right on the border. And so we managed to raise the money, almost $7 million, and then we bought the masks. We got masks from here, got shipped over there for the next round, but then the whole country we mobilized and distributed, and that was a massive effort. And that just happened. All of that came together, and they were like, Mushfiq was sending me messages about procurement of the masks, the quality of the masks, and those are the kind of things that we did. I was talking to this guy who was kind of a random academic who is expert on clothes, how to make mask from your homemade Genji, all these Sando Genjis and stuff, right? So yeah, but the beauty of that was kind of led that to this, because, so many times academics just do research for publication and talks, right? But how many times it's actually either changing policy or directly helping the practitioners? We were doing things on the ground and they were tweaking it, as kind of Mushfiq was kind of coming up, and with the team was very, very tightly integrated. So the implementers and at the same time the researchers who actually did the research. So that really helped. And we thought that, okay, so as we are moving along, and that's also a lot of the early days of BRAC, that was a big part of that asking that question using the researchers and being adaptive, like, is it working, and being honest about it. And then when it's not working, go back to the drawing board and then figure out that why it's not working and then change the model, right? So how many times do we do that in development? And part of the frustration is that there are just success stories. People are loves to, including the donors want to hear success stories. So NGOs actually provide success stories. But on the ground, people know that there are not enough success stories. So there's this NGO donor collusion, and then you have this huge sort of dysfunction going on, and lot of money is getting wasted. So, but again, we want to decolonize development. We want to, even though I'm wearing the relic of colonization, but at the same time, but I think in the end of the day, I think it's really about doing development differently, being honest and being open to failure and being authentic about what is working. And I think that's why this partnership is so important, because this is something that we want to take forward for these newer challenges and crises that are coming in. And even though the pandemic is gone, the climate change is such a huge crisis, and there are solutions needed right now. We need to go back to that drawing table that, people in the southern coast, people in different parts of Bangladesh right now, which is in the forefront of climate change, they are suffering, and that story is not getting told here. They're migrating to the cities, they're living in slums in subhuman conditions, and there needs to be solutions coming in, and solutions needs to be designed, tested, and researchers need to come and tell us that, is it working? If it's not working, then we're not gonna go back to that drawing board. So that's, I think, from a very pragmatic, down-to-earth level, that's why this partnership is important, is because we wanna know. And there are different kinds of crises that are coming, right? So whether it's mental health related, and all of this that cannot be like rich people's disease anymore. Mental health is as a crisis that affects everybody. And we are creating models around these emerging issues where how mental health can be embedded in the primary healthcare model, working with the government as well. So again, we don't have the answers, but we want to understand what is working. So that's where it's coming from.
Okay, sorry, it's going to be really tough. Okay, so a few sentences, okay. Sorry. So one is that I think, so again, the entire idea started with just WhatsApp messages, right? And I would say it's really hard to define still, partly because it's going to be, I think, novel and so therefore hard to define. But it starts with that BRAC has world-class implementation capacity, right? Across Bangladesh and now hopefully in other countries as well, right? And through our affiliates, who are not only at Yale, but across many universities around the world, right, at Y-RISE, we have world-class research and frontier research going on, right? And it makes sense to bring these two streams together to try and build something new. That's what we're after. Okay. Now, the precise definition of how that's going to be structured, we need everybody in the research world to take this seriously. We need also people at the mid-level and the program heads at BRAC to also take it seriously, and I think we will be able to create something interesting. So the other aspect I want to talk about is that sometimes researchers are thought of as like evaluators. That's the language we use, right? Right? Now, I think we will fail if that's what we do. So I can tell you the story of when I met Sir Fazle Abed. So he actually was here about maybe a dozen years ago. He was here and giving a talk, and we were having dinner. And then he asked me what I was up to. And
was at the School of Management?
It was at the School of Management. Oh, okay, that's when we met as well. Yeah, and so I mentioned this, this work on migration in Bangladesh, and so as soon as I said the word migration, the Abed Bhai says, "Oh, you're the migration guy. We keep talking about this in your in our meetings, because we." The idea was that sometimes you can encourage people to migrate away from seasonally famine-prone areas, and it turns out their families get to consume a lot better during the manga season. Okay. So that's the type of relationship I want, which is not that, there is innovation happening somewhere and external evaluators coming in and saying yes or no, this is good. That's, I think, to be successful, we need to be thought partners, right? Because there's innovations that can come from the field. There's innovations that can come from being connected to the literature and learning something from Sierra Leone, right? There's innovations that can come from just thinking through the theory of human behavior, right? And I hope that's where we get to.
Which one of you would like to?
You're the moderator.
Oh, okay. All right. Scott, let's give you a last word there.
He had very little patience for vague, soft-hearted things. I remember once I was at some event. I think it was on the sidelines of it was this month on the sidelines of UN Week, and some young person came up to him. I think it was at UNICEF and said like, "Oh, I want to enter development. What activity? What advice do you have for a young person like me?" And he just says, "Work in the private sector first." Yeah. So that's just an aside. That's not my one sentence. And yet he had very, very little patience for vague, soft-hearted goals, things, okay? But he also was a proponent of the science of hope. Like all this hopey stuff was not something soft for him, right? There was a science to it. And so there's a lot of chatter about the science of this, the science of that, science of scaling. So I would encourage us to look at the intersection of the science of scaling and the science of hope. That's my one sentence.
Do you want to add anything to that?
You wanted to know from me what my dad would think about your collaboration. So I'm glad I came after Scott, because are you trying to say there's something soft and soft-hearted going on here with Y-RISE and BRAC? No, let me just say that my dad put a lot of value on research. And BRAC started its research and evaluation division in the 70s, very soon after the organization started. And he found great value in researchers going in and doing independent research so programs could be tweaked, so we could totally understand the sort of nuances and then think about what could be done to improve things. So from that point of view, he would be very happy. However, he is not the kind of person to really be superlative about anything. So he wouldn't be happy until Y-RISE and BRAC delivered on something. And if you did deliver, he would say, not bad. And if you delivered extremely well, exceedingly well, he would say, not too bad at all.
Wow. So with that, I think we'll take one or two questions and then continue the conversation downstairs. Does anyone have anything you want to ask the panel? Yeah, go ahead in the front. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So rather than question, can I share a tiny story with BRAC? And these are the privileged.
Got it. Here, he wants to hear you. There you go.
Thank you, thank you. So these are our privileged section of the country. I'm not. I was born in a rural village that got electricity in 2000, so literally had to study with a kerosene lamp. And after going to medical school, intention to study public health, I'm probably the only outlier that was against not only BRAC, but all the NGOs. Because so many propaganda that NGOs are coming to, create alternate political system, making people Christian, so many weird, and now I know why it is weird. And then, anyway, long story short, I came to Harvard for my public health training, and then my classmate was from BRAC, Afsana, and we had the opportunity to present a case for Bangladesh immunization story. And that was just like you, I was like, wow. So it was in my country, it was developed in such a way, and we didn't have any idea. The success of BRAC actually happened, I believe, in many different aspects. You already touched upon on that. But getting $100, making 10,000 with your own resources is one of the way that BRAC did that other people did not. So that's why I used to work for Bardem, which is a diabetes hospital in Bangladesh, and they didn't take any external money ever. That was another great model that I like. But I had the opportunity to meet Sir Abed and when at the beginning conversation of the School of Public Health. So my question to you all that, talking about COVID and talking about other stuff, right now I'm like 2 weeks old, brand new Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Quinnipiac University School of Medicine. So I'm doing this similar thing, bringing underserved population, underrepresented population in medicine, in global context, global health and other area. So what BRAC can expand, like scaling in different areas, in the global context like that, education for even underserved in America, in Africa, and other countries. Can any one of you shed a light on that? Thank you.
And could we
Sorry
just-
for the long
let's take-
question.
No worries. Can we take one or two? Yeah, there was one in the back too. No, yeah, great.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for this. So my question was that since 1972, the political landscape has changed multiple times in Bangladesh, and BRAC got bigger and bigger, right? So how did that work out with the government changing, and what were the challenges you faced over time?
And then one more here in the front. Sorry.
Hi. First of all, I feel so proud to be sitting here as a Bangladeshi. Your stories are really inspiring. So my question is, I think BRAC scaled both in terms of depth and breadth. So by depth, I mean going deeper into Bangladesh and then extrapolating the Bangladeshi model to other countries. So how did that extrapolation go? Like, did you copy the Bangladeshi model in other countries, or what are the challenges, if you can say in a nutshell? Yeah.
Okay, we'll take the last one then. Everyone wanted to take it. Yeah, yeah. And then that's it.
Thank you. My name is Robert Kibara. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. And first of all, congratulations to Scott on the launch of the book, and to BRAC for the good job you are doing. So I have a question around how you are able to hold together such a large organization. So 100,000 staff, members, multiple countries, multiple locations, different fields that you are playing in. How do you hold all those people true to purpose, aligned to purpose, so that then scale is sustainable?
No, we don't have to stand in order.
I get to do the politics one. So BRAC, just stayed very neutral. And, unlike few other NGOs in Bangladesh, just, worked with government all the time. So partnered right from the 1980s. So you heard the immunization program. That was one of the first times that BRAC partnered on a large scale. And the government and BRAC covered the whole country immunizing kids. That was in the 90s? 80s, yeah, that's right. So and we've partnered with the government on nutrition, on various things over the years. So it's been a combination of working together. It's, also been our founder's kind of personality, where he's, he doesn't reveal or talk about his politics, and he's just stayed very neutral and worked with both governments and leaders and all of that, because we've had two sort of since the 90s, because up until the 90s, we had military dictators, et cetera, in the 80s and all of that. And then since the 90s, we've had a democracy, and we've had pretty much two leaders switching between each other. Yeah, and so and I think also in Bangladesh, the government has allowed organizations like BRAC and civil society organizations to flourish. Part of the reason is, I can't remember if Asif or Scott were saying that, the needs were great and the government was clear that they couldn't meet the challenges, and so they were happy for people who were willing to sort of complement the government's work to allow them to work. So that definitely worked in Bangladesh. But I think my father also navigated the politics very well, in terms of, and then slowly, just gained respect from the leaders, from the political leaders and all of that. So, they could see sort of the authenticity of purpose of the organization, and that it really wasn't, looking for anything else, and that the purpose of the work was really to help people climb out of poverty and lack of empowerment, powerlessness. And so I think it somehow worked. I think, the government provided space, and then BRAC, sort of did a good job of staying on course.
I would just quickly say that it's worth giving successive governments in Bangladesh credit for allowing this to happen, because for the exact same project that we've tried implementing in other countries, it's not as easy, right?
It was very when in his funeral, all parties leaders came in and basically were very, and I think that part which never happens. Yeah. And one thing that was very, Tamara touched on it, but it was very important that at some point political parties realized that he didn't have personal ambition, because there was always this touchy area that where, like, okay, if you are not coming into our turf and just doing this, we are okay. But if you remotely show political ambition, then we're going to come after you, right? Which happened to Dr. Yunus, right? So I think that kind of completely killed what Grameen could do in Bangladesh and stuff. So, and then there are other examples as well. But he kind of steadfastly basically stayed out of partisan politics. And it was like, I have to work with the government regardless of which party is in power, because in the end, people need to get the support that they need. And if you want to change the system, you have to work with the government. So there was relationship from the highest level with the prime minister to all the way down at the government, like the agriculture officers. So BRAC has many multiple tier of relationships that kind of goes on. He set up the program for public bureaucrats, training program on public policy in BRAC University, where a lot of them have gotten training. In fact, Prime Minister's office right now, the secretary is a BRAC University graduate. So that was a longer term vision that people who are working in the government's public sector, they would also get trained on development, understand what longer term development is, and then you would kind of work within the system to work with them. So that vision was amazing. But going back to what you were saying, I don't think we're going to work in America, sorry. I think the needs are far greater in other countries, and there are far good organizations which are here. But I think our model is, particularly as sort of Bangladesh is in an interesting trajectory right now. So it has remarkably done really well in social indicators, reducing poverty. But there are poverty pockets. There are different kinds of crises coming in. But then also we are kind of expanding in Africa, because we are started a technical assistance program with the ultra poor graduation model to work with governments in countries where there are biggest numbers of ultra poor. So like India and other places in the world, because that's a model, going back to your question now, that Heidi mentioned that when the research of Abhijit Banerjee came in, because that was a model that was tested in different contexts in 6 countries, right? The ultra poor graduation model. And then that definitively showed that it actually worked in different contexts. So models like that, which are proven to work in other contexts, with slight tweaking in terms of how it would need to adapt to the context, is something that we really want to scale up, not just through direct services, but through working with the governments across the world. So we have now set up an entirely different initiative around this. But in other areas, like, again, Bangladesh is like the big lab. innovation lab. That is, a lot of these experiments are happening. Some learnings we take, but it's not a copy, direct copy, obviously, but it is really like, the play lab in early childhood development started in Bangladesh, then contextualized for humanitarian context in the refugee camp. I was taken to Uganda, Tanzania as well. So it's working in different ways, but some of the common universal challenges are actually quite universal, so that works when you look at it.
Okay, with that, I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you all so much for coming. Janani, do you have instructions for us? Do you want to?